the 360 on Energy and Carbon podcast, hosted by 360 Energy. In today's episode, we will be addressing what our podcast title is all about, energy and carbon. Some key points discussed today include what is energy and carbon, why do businesses need to consider them both, and what are ways to manage and strategize energy usage and carbon emissions. Now, let's get into the episode. Welcome back, Dave and John. I'm excited about this week's episode and getting into what energy and carbon really mean. I thought it would be interesting to kick this week's episode off by telling the listeners what you believe is the biggest misconception businesses have about the energy and carbon industry. Dave, how about you start us off on this one?
Yeah, Lysandra, we thought what we do to help everyone out is I would give you sort of what we hear as a business perspective, and John can talk on a technical perspective, what he hears. So here's what I hear most of the time. And one, quite frankly, we talked about this before, energy is not deemed as controllable. It's not a really big deal. It's not that important to us. We've already locked in our supply with the suppliers. That's all we can do. We don't need to do anything else. I hear, the utility takes care of it. We don't actually have to manage it. Or another thing is like someone says, well, it's actually not my job. It's John Smith who has full responsibility, so I don't really care about it. So all those comments are not constructive or helpful because there's so much you can do relating to energy. And so I think most of the time people just dismiss it because someone's not made aware or accountable for some of those things. So I hear this all the time. It just isn't something that's on the radar screen for customers. John, what's your thoughts based on what you heard?
I was going to say, I think you crept slightly into my area, or at least what I was going to say in one thing. I was going to say, I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that somebody else will do something about it and or technology alone will be the answer. And I think this can be quite worrying. Somebody else is going to do something about it. We get this common problem that everybody in the organisation is involved in using energy, but they say, oh, well, it's the responsibility of the facilities manager. They'll look after it. We don't have to look after it. So I think there's that. And then there's the other one, and I think sometimes it's fueled by a bit of fear, is that, this climate change and everything else we're talking about, it's so big. Science is going to crack it. If we just sit back, science will crack it. And without doubt, we've got to look at technology. We've got to look at energy efficient products. We've got to look at green energy. We've got to look at all those technologies. But if we don't put them into a business perspective, we're not going to get it right. I think if I round up what Dave and I are both saying there is that, it's not my job. Science will solve it. Okay, what's next?
Hey, John, there's a couple other things as you're talking that stirred me. One is, look, I changed the lighting. So there's nothing else we can do. It's a project. They think you just do one thing and it's done. And the other thing is, well, there's no incentive. So why should I do anything? And actually, the reason why you would do it is it just makes good business sense. You just need to know the economics of doing it. You don't really always need incentive money from the utility or the government to make you do it or encourage you to do it. If you knew the cost and the implications, a lot of times you would do it without incentive money. And so that's another misconception I hear.
Yeah, and I think picking up on the incentives, you have to be really careful that incentives tend to focus you on the area that the incentives are interested in, and that may not be the area that you should be looking at. I think a classic example of that is an awful lot of incentives are based around electricity use, which makes people think, well, natural gas isn't the problem. When we start talking about carbon and everything else, natural gas is a problem, and it is something we've got to deal with, but we just don't necessarily see the level of incentives, sort of directing people's attention in that direction.
One of the things, another one is that they typically look at energy as one source. Well, it's just electricity we're focusing on. There's nothing else that we should do. When they all have impacts to each other, electricity has impact on gas, and quite frankly, even though water is not deemed as energy, water is a really important utility that uses a lot of energy for pumping and for cleaning. And there's a misconception that you just focus on one element and then you're really good at what you do. but you should be looking at all of them.
Yeah, picking up on your water, Dave, it depends exactly where you are, but water can, as a product, could have a similar energy intensity to steel, which makes you think about it an awful lot more. And in fact, the energy intensity of water is tending to increase over time as we're requiring cleaner water, both in terms of treatment of drinking water, but more importantly, in treating of the wastewater. And so those become linked together.
Well, there definitely is an anonymous John Smith responsible for energy and carbon in many organizations. These were great misconceptions to start thinking about for our listeners and something to keep in mind throughout this episode. What are we referring to when we say energy and carbon? Could you start off by describing what energy is to you?
Go on, Dave.
John,
You do energy. Energy. Let's not get academic about it, but energy is something that does work for us and it delivers a benefit. So, typically energy is something that either makes something hotter, makes it cooler, lights it up, or moves it along. So, that's what, and all of those things we need. If we start coming down to the next level, we all know we've got electricity, we've got natural gas, but we might have LPG, bottled gases. There will be heating oils, there will be solid fuels, which could be highly carbon based like coal, or biomass, timber products, and but biological waste and other things like that. We can get methane from landfill. All of these are different energy sources. And the truth of it is, when we're thinking about energy, we talk about buying energy. We don't actually want energy. We want what it is that energy does. So we want the light. We want the comfort in the space we're in. We want the machinery to work to make our products. And it really, at one level, it wouldn't matter what energy was. And I think that's in part why sometimes it tends to get overlooked, because very rarely do you buy, although I believe Edison, when he started out, he sold electric light as a service and not the electricity. He sold the lighting. And there is talk that we may actually be heading more in that direction. So that's energy there. And then just the other part to it, of course, is that there's energy that you buy in and that there's energy you generate yourself. So if you've got a cogen plant or even a standby generator, you become a producer of energy. But all the time, we're just converting energy from one source into another.
Yeah, and I'm going to add to what John's saying on the misconception. They get a bill, they pay the bill, and that's it. But actually, in the bill, there's a variety of key variables that are distinct from each other that you can actually measure and control. So when people are buying energy in a deregulated marketplace, they'll look at the commodity, but there's that transmission and the distribution piece that is inclusive in the bill that they actually can take action to help mitigate that. And a lot of times people aren't aware of that in deregulated. They're just focused on one item. Same with natural gas. And then in regulated markets, a lot of misconception is, well, it's regulated, I can't actually make any changes. But depending on the utility and how you use energy, there's different rate options that a customer could actually undertake. It's really has a big dependence on how they use energy. And so I think whether it's regulated or deregulated, there are things that customers can undertake and understand to actually measure and manage energy more effectively.
Just interjecting right there, what do you mean by regulated and deregulated?
So regulated would be when you're working with a jurisdiction where the markets, you don't have a choice of your supplier. You have to buy and get the power directly from the utility itself. In deregulated marketplaces, you have an opportunity on the commodity front where you can actually purchase the commodity, whether it's electricity or natural gas, from a variety of suppliers that make that available to you, and they have different pricing options, so you can choose what's best suited to you based on what you need and the terms that you need it by. So that's what I mean by regulated and deregulated per se.
Well, thanks for that. And John, I especially like the analogy of anything that lights up needs to be made cooler, moves it along, requires energy. That was a great way to understand what's included in, overall consumption. Now that we have our first half of our podcast name defined, next is the obvious follow-up. What are you referring to when you say carbon?
I'll kick off on this. Carbon, we've got to be careful, but carbon is a catch-all phrase to cover greenhouse gas emissions. And greenhouse gas emissions are so called because they create the greenhouse effect, the insulating around the globe that traps heat in, that's leading to what was called global warming, now more generally referred to as climate change. So carbon is the measure of it. It gets confusing because the major thing that we're interested in is carbon dioxide, not carbon. And we tend to relate all of the greenhouse gases to a carbon dioxide equivalent. So you would have CO2e for CO2 equivalent. But because that gets rather cumbersome and uncomfortable, you then refer to it just as carbon. But if you're a scientist, you will get really upset about that, because carbon is different from CO2, because carbon's just the carbon bit. And where does all this carbon come from? Well, it comes from our hydrocarbon fuels. And, you know, there's a clue in the title. A hydrocarbon fuel, I mean, if you take natural gas, it's CH4, it's carbon and four of hydrogen. Hydrogen's the bit that's useful. That's what we want. That's the bit that gives us the heat and everything else. The carbon becomes a byproduct. So that becomes, we emit that. That then goes up into the atmosphere, increases the trapping effect of solar coming into the planet, and there we go. We've got global warming. So carbon is the shorthand term for greenhouse gases. There's technically, and it's always made me chuckle, sometimes they refer to a basket of greenhouse gases. I'm not really sure how you put gas into a basket, but it's a notional one. And of that, you know, it includes other things such as methane and refrigerant gases and a whole range. But there are actually, we won't go into them in detail here, but there are 7 gases that are included in the sort of the UN's definition of the greenhouse gases. But that's what we're talking about with greenhouse gases and carbon and emissions. Basically, if you think of it in, let's try a nice simple one. You're driving your car, you put gasoline into the car, that's carbon and hydrogen. You burn it, out the tailpipe comes carbon, and that effectively, the problem with the tailpipe emissions, you see the smoke and muck, but you don't actually see the carbon dioxide. Think of it that way. You're throwing that part of it away. And we've been doing that since the Industrial Revolution, and it's taken us a couple of 100 years to build up the levels that we've got, and then to realise that they are at a critical level. Why are they critical? Because scientists don't really know what's going to happen to the climate. It could go one way or it could go the other. We're already seeing effects like that. I think at the moment, if you're in Las Vegas, you're suffering a monstrous heat wave. You might have looked over the winter. How much snow did you have compared to 10 years ago? You know, the effects are there to see.
And on the business front related to carbon and emissions, there is more of government intervention, financial institution intervention, where organizations, whether they're businesses, municipalities, whatever that might be, they have to play a role to help mitigate their current carbon emissions. And the way it's done now in certain regular areas, it's regulated, where you have to achieve a certain number, or you're penalized or you're taxed based on the carbon emissions you have. And now that's fairly new conceptually within businesses. So a lot of businesses are trying to get a sense of what that does to them, not only for their cost structure, but what does that mean to them in developing their products? What does this mean to them selling to their customers? How will that impact them? And what do they need to do as an organization to ensure they live in this new environment to reduce carbon? It's a brand new thought process, which a lot of people are struggling to get a handle on what they do and how they do it. And as we've alluded in the past, certainly the emissions of carbon is primarily 80% of that is from energy usage in the marketplace. So that's where we're at now on the business front.
Well, carbon is definitely a bit tricky to understand with all the accessory words we hear it thrown with. To add to that, I think carbon is definitely a new word for many organizations, and lately it is in every forward-thinking business plan. So let's get into why carbon is now a hot topic. Can you touch on what common terms like carbon neutral, net zero, and carbon footprint mean?
How long have you got? Okay, let's take them bit by bit. Carbon footprint. Carbon footprint, footprinting is a term that's used for a variety of environmental measures, but it's determining the size of your impact. So for an organisation, your carbon footprint, typically you would calculate it annually, and it's the carbon emissions that you're responsible for or that result from your business. Now, we won't go into it today, but then people are familiar with carbon footprinting and carbon inventories will understand that there are 3 scopes that you measure: scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. And if you're doing a full carbon footprint, you should be doing all 3 scopes. However, for most organisations, you have controls of scopes 1 and 2. And for ease for today, scope 1 is basically fuel that you burn yourself, and scope 2 is electricity that you buy. And typically your starting point on a carbon footprint would be to calculate your annual consumption of natural gas or whatever fuels you're burning, maybe diesel or whatever for a truck fleet, all of that. You calculate that, you calculate your electricity using appropriate factors, you convert that to carbon, that then becomes your carbon footprint. So that's carbon footprint. Carbon neutral and net zero, we've got so many different definitions and things around this. Carbon neutral really it's saying that when you're running your business, you're adding no further carbon to the atmosphere. I think that's the easiest way to think of it. And carbon neutral would normally be thought of as you've gone totally green or renewable with your electricity supplies. You're not doing, and in fact you might even be generating more electricity than you use to compensate for other emissions that you've got. Net zero is a bit like that, but there is a business angle to it, which is that you buy somebody else's carbon savings through things called carbon offset. We've done a webinar on this. I think it would be a couple of podcasts alone to go through all the aspects of carbon offsetting. But if you think about it, we would generally think carbon neutral means that the company or the organisation has got itself to a point where it emits no carbon, or whereas if they've gone for net zero, they may still be emitting carbon, but they've bought credits to cover for it. Some other people may argue with those definitions, but in general, that's what it is. And if we think the goal that most people are heading for is by 2050 to be carbon neutral or net zero, to be in the position that you're not adding any more carbon to the global inventory. Dave.
I think, John, nothing more to add. I think that's a pretty good description, and certainly people can look at our website on some of the webinars that we've done to go into great detail, or Google as well.
John, it's always interesting to hear a different perspective on those well-used phrases. So thank you for that mini carbon and energy refresher. On to my next point. So now that we know what both of you mean by energy and carbon, it's time to get a little more specific for our listeners looking to use this information to better their organization. Dave, how should companies get started on their energy and carbon goals?
I think the first important message that we get to customers when we're talking to them is to ensure that the executives understand the importance and the required buy-in for them to be aware and support this movement going forward. There's many risks possibly associated to the business. Many may not be aware of that, but certainly, to be clear from our experience in energy, without senior management's buy-in and support and interest in the topic, it typically wanes and there's not a lot of movement. So that's first, senior management involvement in developing a strategy, what it means and how it goes forward with the organization. The second thing that needs to be, and John touched upon this before, you actually have to collect data. Most of this information is made readily available from utility bills and from fuel charges. That being said, from our experience, not many people actually collect that information. They may collect how much they spend, but they don't have the usage information. They don't track that. And that's a really important requirement to sort of understand where your carbon footprint is. That's required information. And so that has to be collected and analyzed and put it into perspective so you know what your current status is, what your current footprint is, or what you want to establish as the baseline. And that's to figure out where you are. And then you have to develop a plan that makes sense for you, for your business, on how you're going to mitigate and reduce your carbon footprint. And that could be done in various ways. Common there is buying offsets. Another way is reducing your energy usage. Another way is, generating your own power with renewables, or using biomass for heat, things of that nature. But there are little steps that need to be done, but they're critical pieces that have to be put in place to ensure that you set the foundation so you can start executing. John, do you have anything that you want to add on that?
Yeah, I think because we're talking about both energy and carbon, I think whilst we know they're inextricably linked, when you're talking about doing something about them, they run on two different time tracks. I think the best way of explaining that, if you're going to do something about energy, you know today what that is, and that is you want to reduce how much you're spending on energy. You want to use less, buy it cheaper. You can look at the results of that fairly easily. You can go this year, next year, fine. That's fairly straightforward. When you start looking about carbon, you've actually got to take a much longer horizon. Now, we talked earlier about, the net zero targets being 2050. And the question is, how are you going to get there? You don't just do that by just doing 1 year at a time and seeing what happens. So you have to take a longer term view. And I'm very much in favour of, you don't have to have detailed planning for that future view. But what you do have to do is know exactly what direction you want to go in and commit to that direction. And then you develop your plans as you go forward. I am concerned that with the publicity that net zero and everything's getting, and the UN talking about the race to net zero, is that people are going to rush at this. And actually, it's one of those things. It's urgent, but if you rush at it, you're likely to do the wrong things. So I think you need to think about energy efficiency and procurement of energy and things like that. That's today's job. Reducing your carbon, that's what's going to happen year on year going forward. And those two are linked, but you have to be having that forward vision much more with carbon than you do with energy.
It's a really good point. I mean, we've been working with organizations on energy for many years, and typically it's what we did today, what we are doing next week, what we're doing for the year. But carbon, you got to look out 5 years, if not longer. So that there's a mindset change that has to go on in the organization, and that's really pivotal. I think it emphasizes why you need to have the executive involved, because they do look more long term when they're planning.
I was going to say, I think as well, the other thing is that when we're looking at energy, we're just looking at how we produce, I don't know, let's say we make widgets. How do we make those widgets more efficiently? If we're taking a carbon view, we might be looking at the business as a whole and realize widgets aren't the thing we should be making. And that maybe there's a different product that we should be making, and actually investing in making more efficient widgets, we should be making something else. And that's why you have to have a much bigger picture view when you're looking at carbon.
I think you are both heading towards a similar recommendation then. Like we briefly touched on, many companies have released public statements with a net zero carbon goal, a promise to use sustainable energy measures. As you both know, the list of sustainability pushes is a very long one. John, you mentioned these targets previously. How do organizations begin to meet these company targets that they have publicly promised?
Oh, now you put it in that way. I think actually what you've got to do is be really careful before you put your targets out there. I think there are too many people jumping to put targets out. But here's the thing, how do you get towards those targets? You have a process in place that actually develops meaningful targets, both from a technical and a business point of view for your business. You then have those in place. You've then got to get strategic. This is like anything else in business, and this is where if you like, I move away from being the technical guy to being the business guy as well. You've got to have a strategy. You've got to have programs. You've got to have tactics to deliver. You've got to know why you want to go where you're going, and have the plans in place to do it. Setting those targets is actually part of that process. And it's all too easy, and we see this, it's all too easy to throw out long distance targets and then you don't do anything because you can get by for a couple of years without saying anything. So I think it's critical that you take this on to be a core aspect of how you're doing business.
Yeah, I think as you're talking, John, I'm thinking that it's absolutely essential, but I also think people need to start within their organizations becoming a lot more literate and understanding the implications, so they can take the actions. Certainly you'll rely in getting some assistance from different parties, but ultimately it's got to be the company's responsibility to take that on and not be solely reliant on a quick solution like, oh, I'm buying offsets and I'm done. There's a lot of options that need to be considered that could have cost implications to you and your business going forward. So that will be very important for organizations.
This is a great point. Sorry, John, to conclude this week's episode. Next week's episode will focus on businesses' energy strategies, so be sure to tune in then to hear a more focused approach on the topics mentioned today. Thank you for your time today, Dave and John. I look forward to talking to you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lucinda.
That's all for today's episode of the 360 on Energy and Carbon podcast. Thanks for listening. Make sure to check us out on our website at 360energy.net and follow us on LinkedIn at 360 Energy Inc. Tune into our podcast on Apple Music and Spotify by searching the 360 on Energy and Carbon. You can watch the video recording and subscribe on YouTube at 360 Energy Inc. See you next week.